Good morning, dear Mr. Hinterdobler, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. It's wonderful to see you all here. Let me start by thanking the representation for hosting us here. It's always a pleasure. We now have a history or almost a tradition of holding conferences here, and I think it's a great location. I mean, that's obvious because it's so close to the European institutions, but it's also a great location because it's our home state, so we do feel at home. Thank you very much, and we very much appreciate this cooperation. Thanks also to all of you, to the speakers and everybody for coming here this morning to discuss these very important issues. One announcement I have to make is that Sabine Weyand has had to cancel her speech because there was something that requested her to travel suddenly. So that's the bad news. The good news is Denis Redonnet, so the Deputy Director General of Trade in the European Commission has agreed to come and give the keynote for her because Sabine cannot come. I will introduce him later. What I'd like to do in terms of introduction is talk about the overall subject and talk about a report we published today. So a report, an EconPol report we produced on the geoeconomics of trade, and I guess this report nicely captures some of the issues we will be discussing here and also offers some hopefully interesting results on this. So I would like to start by the observation that if you think about the EU as a geoeconomic actor, the first thing to acknowledge, and I suppose everybody knows that in this room, is that the EU's overall role, its weight in the world economy has declined. So the EU has become less important because other countries, other economic areas, China and others, have become more important. So the overall EU's overall weight in world trade has declined, as you see here. So, you know, the blue curve on the import and the export side is going down, and of course the role of China has been rising over the decades. So the EU has become smaller, but the EU's dependence on globalization, the EU's dependence on trade has been growing. So this is all value added in the EU, depending on trade with non-EU countries. So depending on exports to non-EU countries or depending on imports from non-EU countries, you know, the dependence of the EU has increased. So globalization has become more important for us. This is not self-evident because if you consider China, for instance, the role of external trade, of exports and imports for China has declined, maybe surprisingly. Of course, to some extent, this is mechanic because the Chinese economy has been growing very much. The construction sector, as we all know, has been growing very strongly. That's a reason for concern to some extent today. Nevertheless, if we think about geoeconomics and strategic aspects of international trade, these are very important developments we should bear in mind. What you can now do is look at the linkages between the EU, the US and China. So as it were, the maybe most important geopolitical actors. And what you see here is that there are important dependencies, but they are asymmetric to some extent. So the US on the import and export side depends less on these two other countries or groups of countries than either the EU or China. And I guess that to some extent explains why US policies are also different. And these differences also suggest that EU interests are not entirely aligned with US interests. It's not the only reason, but it's one reason why they are not aligned. One finding of this study, which is maybe less known, is that if you look at the different sectors, what you see is that the sectors who most depend, the European sectors who most depend on international trade, are the high-tech manufacturing sectors. So in terms of geopolitics, is this good or bad news? Something we may discuss here, but if you have the idea that these are the key value-added drivers in Europe, these sectors are even more globalized, depend even more on international integration. So if geopolitical tensions are a burden and lead to frictions in international trade, these sectors will bear a significant part of the burden, and that's problematic if we think about the impact these frictions have on Europe. So what we've then done in this report as a second step is to simulate changes in the geoeconomic environment. So far, this is just the description of trade relations, but how will these trade relations change if there are geopolitical tensions? Now, we have looked at a couple of scenarios in this report, and I'll be brief here. We focus on the idea that there are two blocks in the world economy, one Western bloc and one Eastern bloc, and how we have defined this is related to UN voting behavior, but it's basically the US, the China-Russia bloc on one side, and the US, the Western bloc on the other side. But then there's also a group of countries we call non-aligned countries, and one of the findings of this report is in fact that these non-aligned countries are very important. So what we do then is consider a number of scenarios. So one scenario being an EU reshoring scenario, where the EU imposes trade barriers against imports from other countries and engages in reshoring. So unsurprisingly, that's a very costly policy, something one can do, but it's a very costly policy. But then we also look at fragmentation. So in one scenario, the non-aligned countries working more with the West, or in other scenarios, the non-aligned countries aligned, cooperating with the East. And I don't want to go through all these scenarios, but I think one of the relevant findings here is that the US is least vulnerable, maybe unsurprisingly, to trade barriers, but China by far is most vulnerable to these countries. And what we also show here is that the West is much more interesting for the non-aligned countries than the East. So that's a strategic advantage, at least if you think about the economic costs of trade barriers. So overall, the West is in not such a bad position regarding this debate. The West, the geopolitical debate, the West has a strong interest in cooperating with the non-aligned countries, and that of course points to the fact that from that perspective the EU has a strong interest in getting things like Mercosur done and not stopping it. That again, I guess from an economic point of view is not surprising, but it's important. So there's also more stuff on the sectoral impact, and I'd like to conclude with some questions maybe for this conference. So when we think about trade dependencies, we tend to just portray the volume of trade relations, value added depending on trade relations. But what does this actually mean? Should we focus more on high value added sectors, on high margin sectors maybe, or on substitutability? Then trade is one thing. How about outward foreign investments? So, BASF is an example of a company investing very heavily in China. Is this, in geoeconomic terms, an advantage for us or a disadvantage? It's not quite clear. How about inward foreign direct investment in the EU? Is Chinese ownership of a port terminal in Hamburg a strategic advantage or a disadvantage? A lot of people think it's a disadvantage, but if you think about this strategically, inward foreign direct investment is like having hostages. So in the case of a conflict, you can expropriate it, it's great. But then you can ask, can you expropriate it really? So I guess when you think about it, you come to the conclusion that inward foreign direct investment is neither necessarily an advantage nor a disadvantage. What it is depends on your own domestic structures. If you have a domestic structure where your administration is able to supervise the infrastructure and to intervene if there is an abuse, and if you have the legal setup that allows you to expropriate the foreign investment is a strategic advantage. If we are like that, we should invite the Chinese to buy more ports. But if we think our administration cannot oversee the infrastructure, doesn't understand what's going on, may misabuse, and if we cannot intervene, expropriate, and so on, then the same investment is a strategic disadvantage. And I think our debate about, a lot of our public debate about geopolitical implications of foreign direct investments, you know, a lot of this debate is just too shallow. You know, it's just like going like, oh, you know, it's a Chinese investment, it's bad. You know, again, whether it's bad or good depends on how we have positioned ourselves and what our own capabilities are. If we think about, if we compare the port to telecommunications infrastructure, I think there are differences, you know, in the extent to which our authorities can oversee these structures. There are differences, so maybe we need to treat them differently, so we need a more differentiated debate here. Dependencies, I mean, we've seen here in our study there are mutual dependencies. Probably China even depends more on the West just in terms of trade than vice versa, but are mutual dependencies a protection when we deal with authoritarian states? When we think about our experience with Russia, maybe not. You know, maybe authoritarian states don't care about imposing costs on their population, whereas democracies care. And finally, a question I would love to see answered at this conference is, so who is actually responsible? So do companies, I mean, you might say, okay, there are risks in China now. You know, BASF should deal with it. You know, it's not a problem for governments. Governments are not responsible. You know, if BASF loses money in China, it's their problem. It's not the problem of the government. But then maybe there are market failures, or maybe there are externalities, too big to fail problems and the like, that do imply governments have to do something. And if we think governments have to do something about de-risking, let's call it, in China, how do we do it? What are the instruments? So I think the distribution of responsibilities here, what do we expect from companies and what do we expect from governance is not very clear either. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing all these questions answered here. Now, I'm delighted to welcome Denis Redonnet, I hope that's the right pronunciation, who will give the keynote. Denis Redonnet, as many of you know, is Deputy Director General and Chief Trade Enforcement Officer in the Directorate General for Trade in the European Commission. He's an economist by training and started his career as a corporate banker for a French bank in the city of London. Since 1995, he has been a European Commission official. He's held various positions in the Monetary, International Economic Affairs and Internal Market Directorate Generals of the European Commission. He served as advisor to EU Trade Commissioner Pascal Lamy and was Deputy Chief of Staff to EU Trade Commissioner Peter Mandelson. Afterwards, he headed the WTO division and then the strategy division in the Director General for Trade, and between 2015 and 2020 he acted as Director for WTO Legal Affairs and Trade in Goods. So there are few people, I suppose, in Brussels and the world who know more about trade than Denis. So I'm very grateful that you are here. Thanks for coming, and I'm looking forward to your keynote. The floor is yours. Thank you.